This video is brought to you by Squarespace. A little under 3 years ago, Andor Season 1 was released, and it is without question one of the best and most brilliant pieces of Star Wars media ever created. With the second and final season less than a month away, it's time to look back at Season 1 and what made it so great. More importantly than that, however, we need to look at how Andor was able to separate itself from the breadth of mediocre at best Star Wars content put out on Disney+. On November 8th, 2018, Lucasfilm officially announced Cassian Andor, one of the main characters of Rogue One, would be getting his own spin-off series. The reaction to the announcement was quite mild. At the time, only The Mandalorian had been announced on Disney+, and even though Rogue One was met with mostly positive feedback from audiences, people weren't clamoring for more stories with Cassian Andor. It was revealed that Stephen Schiff was brought on as showrunner and executive producer, but over a year and a half later, in April of 2020, Schiff was replaced by Tony Gilroy as lead showrunner. Gilroy was not an unfamiliar name to the Star Wars fandom. Many looked at him as the savior of Rogue One. To provide context, roughly 6 to 7 months before the release of Rogue One in December 2016, the movie went under extensive reshoots. Supposedly, Lucasfilm was not happy with the direction of the film, and a lot needed to change. In hindsight, considering Kathleen Kennedy has had this problem with pretty much every Star Wars project, it's hard to say for certain how bad the original version of Rogue One was. But regardless, Lucasfilm brought in Tony Gilroy to not only rewrite a significant amount of the movie, but also to serve as secondary director behind lead director Gareth Edwards. We will probably never know what specifically or how much of Rogue One we can credit Gilroy for, but what we can do is look at the teaser for Rogue One we got before Gilroy was brought on. It is clear from this teaser that at least the third act of the movie was going to be drastically changed. In the teaser, we saw shots of Jyn and Cassian running with the Death Star plans through a train station. We saw them also running with the plans on a beachfront, and we also saw Orson Krennic walking on that beachfront in the middle of a battle. For those of you who remember the final battle of Rogue One, you will remember this never even remotely happens. There was also one piece of behind-the-scenes material that appeared to show Cassian dead by a bunker door. Changing the death of a character is a massive change. Now, the only official reports we've gotten was that Gilroy pretty much rewrote the entire third act, which these original teasers seem to support. Considering the third act is without question the best part of the movie, that is why Gilroy was deemed the savior of Rogue One, fair or not. So bringing on the savior of Rogue One to lead the prequel to Rogue One was something that had fans optimistic. Principal photography began in summer of 2020, during the height of the pandemic, and the show premiered over 2 years later in September of 2022. Fans have a complicated relationship with the Disney Plus era of Star Wars. Most people like The Mandalorian, and almost everyone loves Andor, but outside of that, the shows have ranged from mediocre to disappointing to so bad it set the fandom ablaze. I have reviewed every single one of the seasons of Star Wars on Disney+, each one without fail. I have noticed these shows making the same mistakes over and over again, all of them except Andor. So what does Andor do differently? This show isn't great simply because it's the best looking show on Disney+. It's not simply great because it's 12 episodes while every other show is usually 8 episodes. I wouldn't even say it's great simply because of the talented acting and directing. All of these are factors for sure, but the biggest reason why Andor was so great, and this is going to be the thesis of this video that I will repeat over and over again, was because Andor takes Star Wars seriously. Andor is the only show on Disney Plus that treats Star Wars seriously. There aren't scenes of grown men being unable to capture a little girl in the forest. There's no scenes of bugs attacking Sith Lords and flying them away. There's no scenes of droids repeatedly yelling yes for comedic relief. There's no scenes of our main character surviving an orbital bombardment and then fighting zombies. There's no scenes of witches singing weird-ass songs. There's no scenes of 10-mile-per-hour chases on speeder bikes. There's no scenes of Lizzo and Jack Black. There's no scenes of little girls hiding in coats as they escape Imperial bases. Everything in Andor is taken seriously. One specific thing it absolutely takes seriously is its political message. messaging. For some reason, talking about the politics of Star Wars is a heated debate these days, mostly because people claim Disney Star Wars has been way too political by being woke. I'm not interested in the woke debate, but what I am interested in are the real political ideas explored in Star Wars. The original trilogy explored ideas of fascism and rebellion, obviously. The prequels explored how fascism rises and how brittle democracies can be. The sequels explore pretty much nothing. War profiteering and animal cruelty are briefly touched on, but the trilogy as a whole has nothing to say on that front. Even when these stories are trying to be political, it's done in a mocking way, like with L3 and Solo. Don't get me wrong, I love The Mandalorian, but that show has nothing political to say. It's just the story of a father and a child. Andor expands on the themes of the George Lucas movies. It's the first Disney Star Wars project to do that. Andor at its core is about the reaction to oppression. What causes people to become radical enough that they want to join a rebellion against an empire? A big theme of this show are the ties between complacency and fascism. This is something I'll dive into within each specific arc. Speaking of each arc, each one challenges a pillar of our institutions. Andor is more than just saying fascism bad. It explores that question in so many different ways. It's also important to note Diego Luna's influence on this show. Diego Luna is not just the lead actor in this show, he's an executive producer. He has direct input on what happens in this show. When you see Diego Luna's life and what motivates him as a person, it's not hard to draw parallels between that and what's in Andor. Growing up, Diego Luna was actively involved in protests against the Mexican government. In 1994, Luna joined the Zapatista Army of National Liberation protests, fighting for the rights of indigenous people in Chiapas, the country's southernmost state. If you dig deeper, you can see where Luna is involved politically in modern-day current events. I'm a firm believer that passion can be felt through the screen. Sure, Luna may not have written any of the episodes of Andor, but he was definitely involved, and it's very likely he was passionate about Andor exploring all these political ideas. There's such a contrast between someone like him and some of the other lead actors in Star Wars, actors that seem hell-bent on trolling the fans at times. It's just so refreshing to see a lead actor so invested in what the show is trying to say, rather than just repeating over and over again how grateful they are to be in Star Wars. The other important key to Andor's success is how it acknowledges its role as a prequel. Andor is not simply a spin-off show, it is a prequel to Rogue One, which is also a prequel. This had been something that Gilroy had emphasized repeatedly throughout the press conferences of Season 1. Why does this matter? Well, because there are so many moments in Season 1 alone that add weight to Rogue One. Both Rogue One and Andor begin with Cassian killing someone in cold blood. How they react is different, and that is a part of his arc. In Andor, there's a repeated use of the word climb, that if the characters want freedom, they're gonna have to climb for it. The last thing Cassian does in Rogue One is climb for the plans to the Death Star. K2SO dies yelling at Cassian to climb. One thing Cassian says over the phone right before he learns about his mother's death is that he wanted her to know that she would be proud of him. Marva really mattered to Cassian. In Rogue One, to reassure Jyn in a time of certain death, he tells her that her father would be proud of her. The arcs between Jyn in Rogue One and Cassian in Andor are rather similar. Jyn says in Rogue One that the Empire is not a problem if you're not looking up. This is a central theme of the Narkina 5 arc, that eventually fascism will come for those people who are not looking up. What happens in this show will shape Cassian in helping Jyn change in Rogue One. The moment the rebellion becomes real for Cassian is after he learns about his mother's death. That scene ends with Cassian looking at the sunset over a beach. So Cassian's rebellion began on the beach, and it ended on a different beach. There's a chance that one of these things I just mentioned is pure coincidence, but Tony Gilroy and the rest of the writers on Andor have earned the benefit of the doubt. This is not Dave Filoni we're talking about here, the man whose narrative depth reminds you of other projects he created. This is no J.J. Abrams, the man who desperately wanted to remind you that Chewbacca never got a medal. Gilroy clearly has put so much passion and thought into the show, so much so that if something might feel like a stretch, I will assume it was intentional. When you take the politics and the themes seriously, when you take the movie It's a Prequel of seriously, you get something as great as Andor. What I want to do for the rest of this video is go through each arc and explore how by simply taking things seriously, the show benefits in so many ways. The three main things I want to look at for each arc are how the plot is taken seriously, aka the importance of logical consistency, how by taking details and events seriously, the story builds tension, and obviously by taking characters and their motivation seriously, we get a plethora of fascinating and complex ones. For the sake of this video, I will divide the show into 4 arcs: the Ferrix Arc, episodes 1 through 3, the Aldhani Arc, episodes 4 through 6, the Narkina 5 arc, episodes 7 through 10, and the concluding arc of episodes 11 and 12. So let's begin with the Ferrix Arc. Plot and narrative structure are so important to telling a cohesive story. Plot may not be as glamorous as, say, themes or characters or cinematography, but a good plot helps reinforce everything else in the story. There's been a common trend lately that I've noticed within film discourse that I want to talk about, and it's absolutely something I'm victim of too, so I'm not trying to say I'm better than anyone else. I often notice that people love certain movies or shows because they have characters they're really invested in, or the themes are something they deeply resonate with. There's nothing wrong with that. Love what you love. But then they'll often question why more people don't love said story. And it's usually because the flow of the plot is a disaster. When you have a theme you're trying to convey, but the events that happen throughout the story don't make sense or seem illogical or disjointed, it can really undermine said themes. Both the Star Wars prequels and sequels do this. Both try to convey themes that are interesting, but upon an ounce of scrutiny, they fall apart because the narrative structure is so bad. When I look at maybe the worst plot progression I've ever seen in Star Wars, I can't help but think about the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker. Rey and her friends arrive on the planet Pisana because they are looking for a Sith Wayfinder. When they arrive, there happens to be a huge parade going on that happens once every 40 years or so. While they're there, they happen to come across Lando, who can thankfully point them in the right direction. While they're getting chased on their speeders, they get blown up and happen to fall right on quicksand. Thankfully, the guy they were looking for happened to die in this exact cave. To go one step even further, they happen to find this guy's Sith dagger that can perfectly lead them to the Wayfinder. Then a giant worm shows up that Rey happens to know how to heal, and then the worm happens to make a giant hole that the crew can escape from. This is coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. When you have a plot that progresses this way, then your story has no momentum. Nothing really matters because everything happens by accident. There's no cause and effect that drives the story forward. It's just chance after chance. Let's compare this to Andor and how with this first arc specifically, everything just flows perfectly together. And every time something does come up out of the blue, does it make sense? Does it feel like a logical jump you could make? So the season begins and Cassian runs into some trouble with cops. He kills them and runs away. As a result, there is now an investigation into the person who killed the cops. The cops are eventually able to find a lead and a person of interest. How were they able to identify Cassian? Well, Cassian was at a brothel and a lot of people saw him there, including one of the women that worked there. Back on Ferrix, Cassian is worried about getting arrested. So what does he do? He reaches out to his ex-girlfriend to try and set him up with a buyer so he can get credits and run away. When he talks to his ex-girlfriend, what happens? Well, her current boyfriend finds out and gets jealous. Therefore, when he hears that Cassian is a wanted man, he reaches out to the cops so they can arrest Cassian and get him out of the picture. Does this make sense? Absolutely. Jealous boyfriends and girlfriends exist everywhere. I don't think any of us would be thrilled to see our significant other talking to their ex. The cops eventually arrive on Ferrix looking for Cassian. While this happens, they run into some trouble because the people of Ferrix are all working together to stop the cops. The right question here is not, does this make sense? It's, was this set up? If the people of Ferrix just decided to help Cassian, it would make sense, but it would feel a little out of the blue. Thankfully, the show devoted most of the first 3 episodes to showing us how close of a community Ferrix is. So when it comes time for said community to help Cassian, I totally expected this to happen because it was set up properly. Eventually, Cassian runs into Luthen. We learn that Luthen happens to know almost everything about Cassian. Furthermore, we don't ever even learn how Luthen knows everything about Cassian. Bix tells us she didn't tell him, him, so it had to have been someone else. This could have easily been bad writing. Of course, this one guy happens to know everything about Cassian, and of course, we never find out why. But as the story progresses, we learn that Luthen is a very cautious man, someone who has spies everywhere, and is willing to sacrifice the lives of people on his own side if it means preserving his cause. So looking back at this, can I buy that Luthen would somehow be able to learn a lot about Cassian? Yes, I can. This is how you progress a plot. There's no holes here, there's no giant leaps in logic, everything that happens makes sense. It flows in a way that builds to a climactic third episode. There are causes and effects, causes and effects. Eventually, as we'll see, Cassian killing those two cops has a chain reaction that leads to pretty much every event in this story. Actions have consequences. The other brilliance of this is how new information is presented to us. By the time we reach the end of the season, there are like 6 or 7 different storylines going on. TV shows especially need to be very careful with this. When you have so many storylines, it's easy for the viewer to feel lost or overwhelmed at times. But this is never a problem with Andor, and it's because new storylines and characters are introduced only when they become relevant. I love to describe it like a tree branch. You start from the base, and new branches are introduced only when they become relevant to the story. So the season begins with Cassian killing the cops. His story is the only branch. Shortly afterwards, Cyril and Pre-Mor are introduced. They are only introduced once they find out about the murders, something directly related to Cassian. In the second episode, Luthen is introduced only once he is on his way to get Cassian. Bix is introduced when Cassian meets up with her and asks her for help. By the end of the arc, there are now 4 POV characters, and each one is introduced to us once they become directly relevant to Cassian's story, or they are Cassian. In the next arc, we are introduced to Vel only once she meets Cassian. We are introduced to Mon Mothma only after she interacts with Luthen, a POV character. And we only learn about Dedra Meero after the incident at Ferrix, the event that sparks her interest and makes her relevant to the story. Every single character we meet on the heist, we meet through Cassian's perspective, and then the characters are developed after they are introduced. All these politicians we meet are only through Mon Mothma's perspective, the newest POV character. No character in Andor just appears out of the blue. No storyline is introduced for no reason. Characters and plot lines are only introduced once they have a direct relevance to the story. That is how you develop a plot. That is proper narrative structure. You think this all sounds simple, but so many shows these days make these same mistakes. But not Andor. The second main point I mentioned before is how Andor is able to pay enough attention to detail and take its time with said detail seriously that the end of the arcs have so much tension. The first arc does this in a few ways. I already hinted at one way, and that's the attention to detail with the people of Ferrix. There are so many little details that on their own don't mean much, but they add up, building that sense of community. There's the one guy who loves ringing the bells seriously. He seems like he loves his job. There's the wall of gloves that shows us how these workers openly hang their stuff around other people without worrying about theft. When Cassian goes around town, everyone knows who he is. That's an excellent way to show a town is close because everyone knows each other. When Pre-Mor first arrives, we hear these people outside ask why they're invading Marva's home. They're saying things like, "What are you doing with Marva? Leave her alone." Good neighbors are a sign of a close community, and the most obvious detail is everyone in town banging on metal to scare away Pre-Mor. So many people have complained that these first episodes of Andor are slow. Sure, they are a bit slower, but the big moments of the season only work if the story takes its time developing these details. The climax of the season is the people of Ferrix coming together to fight back against the Empire. That only works if you spend a lot of time with these people. If you don't develop that community of Ferrix, then the revolt at the end falls flat. The other part of the story this opening act devotes attention to is obviously Pre-Mor. A more inexperienced writer could have easily written off the Pre-Mor characters. Just have Tim call the Empire and then have a bunch of faceless stormtroopers fight Cassian. But by having these Pre-Mor cops play an active role in this first arc, the third episode is so much more tense. For the first 2.5 episodes, there's no immediate threat to Cassian after the cops are killed. We learn he is trying to get away, and he's trying to do it quickly. But because we know Pre-Mor is on his ass, we know that it's all likely going to build to a climactic showdown. Pre-Mor arrives on Ferrix, and Cassian hasn't even left yet. We are anticipating this confrontation. That tension is building. Just Right made an excellent point in his Andor video that I want to reiterate here, and it's that with each Andor arc, the writers tell us exactly what the threat is before our characters face off against it. In the first arc, we are shown all 14 Pre-Mor cops and officers that are going to Ferrix. We know exactly what Cassian is against. When he starts killing them one by one, we know how many are left. When Syril sends one of these squads to attack Cassian and Luthen inside this building, we know a squad consists of 4 people. So when Cassian and Luthen first interact, we know they are fighting 4 people. During the Aldhani Arc, we get 2 whole episodes telling us exactly what the characters will run into during the heist. How many people will be in the bunker, how many TIE fighters they're gonna have to avoid, how long the eye will last, establishing their window. In the prison arc, we are famously told that there are never more than 12 officers on each level. When the prisoners are all escaping, we know exactly what they're up against. In the final arc, we hear Miro tell us exactly how many soldiers they're gonna have monitoring the funeral. So when the people of Ferrix revolt, we know what they're up against. This is another way to build tension. How many times have we seen our heroes in Star Wars going guns blazing through hallways, fighting countless stormtroopers or whatever? There's not much tension now, is there? But by taking the time to show us the threat, that subconsciously tells the viewer that the threat needs to be taken seriously. This builds tension for the climaxes of each arc. By taking the villains seriously, the action of Andor is so much better. Now, what about the characters? There are obviously so many characters we can talk about, but in this first arc, I want to focus on 2 characters, Cassian and Syril. As we'll come to learn, Cassian's arc is about how a man becomes radical enough to join a rebellion. The movies have often explored this, but they don't have the time to really develop this thoroughly. It's usually just, oh, the Empire is bad, someone I loved was killed, I'm ready to join the rebellion. For a character like Luke, it's a lot easier to join the rebellion because the rebellion was already a fully formed alliance. With Cassian, there is no big alliance, so how do you convince us that he will join them, especially when he begins the story so apathetic about fighting the Empire? Well, the first 3 episodes don't show him change in any meaningful way, and he's not exposed to anything he didn't already know. He already knows he hates the Empire, and seeing Pre-Mor attack his home doesn't change that. Where these episodes matter is establishing Cassian's apathy. He repeatedly mentions to Luthen that he just wants to be left alone and that he doesn't want to fight the Empire for real. In order for him to realize his worldview is wrong, the story needs to thoroughly establish that worldview first. So there's not much here for Cassian in these first 3 episodes. I'm still so conflicted about the flashback sequences. In my previous video I made on Andor just after the first season concluded, I said that these flashbacks were largely pointless. I got challenged on that by the comments, so this time around I spent a lot of time trying to convince myself otherwise. I went on the Andor subreddit and read every comment explaining the point behind the flashbacks. While I certainly think a lot of these points are insightful, I still think the flashbacks are largely ineffective. I get the parallels between him being taken away from his home in both the past and the present. I get that it shows the early stages of Cassian's relationship with his mother. I get that there's also some hidden critiques of capitalism because it appears this mining accident resulted in the death of every adult. I still think that there could have been a better way to make these flashbacks more effective. But anyway, that's how Cassian's story develops in this opening arc. As we progress through each arc, I'll illustrate how each one shows Cassian changing. Let's talk about Syril. What the writers did with Syril is so genius because he's not a character that anyone should be invested in watching. He's a stuck-up Imperial loyalist that is very easy to dislike. So how do the writers get us invested in him and his struggle? Well, they do this by getting us on his side, which is strange because he's trying to arrest the main character. In Syril's first scene, they do an excellent job contrasting him with the higher-ups at Pre-Mor. Just by the way he is standing, we can tell he takes his job seriously. And by the way the other guy is sitting, we can tell he doesn't take his job seriously. We know the cops that Cassian killed were assholes, but Syril doesn't know this. From his perspective, 2 of his colleagues were just killed and he wants justice. And from our perspective, the head guy is telling Syril to stay out of it not because he knows the cops were douchebags, but because investigating those murders would be too much of an inconvenience on Pre-Mor and it could potentially make them look bad. good. So even though we don't want Syril to succeed, in the context of just Pre-Mor, we are on his side because we know he's correct. That is such a great way to get us on a villain's side. Even though we know Syril is just an extension of Imperial oppression, the writers make it so easy for us to put ourselves in his shoes that we're on his side. They do the same thing with Miro in the next arc, but more on that later. So that's how the writers are able to get us invested in two characters that are on polar opposite sides of this conflict. It's really well done. Before we move on to the Aldhani arc, let's discuss what political message Arc 1 is exploring. You could argue that Arc 1 is criticizing the police, but it's much deeper than that. This arc is largely a commentary on how easy it is for people to perpetrate oppression. When you look at Syril and the other Pre-Mor cops, they don't scream fascist to you. These aren't people like Tarkin, someone who is gladly willing to blow up a planet. They aren't even someone like Dedra Meero, who gleefully tortures people. Oppression often spreads by ordinary people thinking they are doing the right thing. Syril believes that by going after Cassian, he is maintaining peace, order, and justice. In doing so, he overextends his power, invading an old woman's home, threatening a handful of other people, and even having one of his friends kill an innocent man. A man, mind you, that tipped Pre-Mor off in the first place. Fascism spreads by ordinary people doing ordinary things. Syril never takes the time to contemplate his actions. He never considers what the regime he supports actually believes in. More often than not, these people can be more dangerous than the mustache-twirling villains, and that's what makes a character like Syril so interesting. The Ferrix plotline establishes the plot wonderfully, it builds tension, it develops the characters, and it has its own political commentary. Let's see how the Aldhani arc continues this trend. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 14.3% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. The Aldhani arc is the arc that really sets in motion the rest of the series. The way this event plays out changes the storyline for each and every one of our characters. So when we discuss how actions have consequences, we'll take a look at the fallout of the heist and how it affects everything. But just looking at this arc specifically, most of the arc is just a small continuation of Cassian's story, or an introduction to the rest of the main players of the series. Remember what I said in the first arc about how characters are introduced in this show. They are only introduced through the perspective of characters we already know. Since we had spent a whole episode with Cassian and Luthen and we have a good idea of who Luthen is, in the 4th episode he is ready to become a POV character. After he drops Cassian off at Aldhani, we see his world. We see his shop and how he handles business, we meet his assistant who also becomes a brief POV character later on, and through him we meet Mon Mothma, who definitely becomes a POV character. Just as I emphasized before, this is the most effective way to introduce multiple characters. Now, the one exception to this is of course Dedra Meero. She is not introduced to us through an already existing POV character, but she is introduced to us naturally, and that is through the events on Ferrix. As we saw in the first arc, not only was there anti-imperial activity by some of the locals, but there was a Starpath unit that Cassian was willing to trade to Luthen. During their escape, Cassian made it a big deal that he had to get the Starpath unit. Luthen eventually convinced him that it didn't really matter and that he was mostly just after Cassian himself. Most stories would probably just ignore the Starpath unit after that. Cassian lost it and it doesn't matter anymore, right? But what Andor does is it uses it to bring in a whole new section of the story, and that's the ISB. Actions have consequences. As we learn, the Starpath unit becomes what Meero focuses on to uncover the rebel plot. This eventually leads her to gaining more power and becoming arguably the main villain of the story by the end of the season. So because Meero and the ISB are only introduced through direct consequences of our main character's actions, it feels organic and thus is a great way to introduce the character. As I said before, we'll really see how this all takes off come the Narkina 5 arc. What I love the most about this Aldhani arc is the attention to detail. A heist is something that we have seen in Star Wars plenty of times, and more broadly we have seen infiltration missions maybe 100 times. This happened in the first Star Wars movie, it happened like 6 times throughout the rest of the Star Wars movies, it happens in the Clone Wars a handful of times, and it happens in Rebels like every other episode. Usually when these missions take place, there's not much planning that goes into them. Like in the classic Star Wars, they kind of just wing the plan to rescue Leia. Given the tone of that movie, winging it makes it feel a lot more fun and adventurous, which is what the movie was going for. But with Andor, a show that is a lot more serious, having Cassian and some of the other rebels wing a heist doesn't feel right. So what do the writers do? They devote an entire 2 episodes to planning and building up this heist, and then the 3rd episode is the actual heist. Never have I seen a plan in Star Wars be so thoroughly set up and explained before. They go over in depth the schematics of the base. They go over the marching that they need to do so they look like proper Imperials. They have Cassian learn part of the Donnie language so he fits in. I love that the entire plot point of the 4th episode was that this plan had been in the works for months, but because Cassian was brought on last minute, everyone is pissed off. Yeah, that sounds like something that would realistically happen. Setups and payoffs are more than just showing off something and then showing it again later on. It's also about the time and attention given to whatever is being paid off. Why are championship events in sports so popular? The reason the Super Bowl is so popular is because it had an entire season's worth of build-up leading to a singular game. So with Andor, the more time and attention given to the planning of this heist, the more impactful the heist actually feels. My favorite moments of the arc are the little moments where we just see our characters stressing out. Cassian has a little talk with Nemik, who is stressing out, and I love that Luthen, the guy who isn't even on Aldhani, is stressing out too. It's not just the action of something that's powerful, but the reaction. Seeing all our characters react to the events that are about to unfold adds weight to the events themselves. And just as I mentioned before, going through the entire plan and what enemies they will come across also adds to that weight. In short, there's nothing in particular that was special about the Aldhani heist. It just involved our characters sneaking in, stealing money, and escaping on a ship. We've seen shit a lot more impressive than that. So what makes the heist so great? All of the attention to detail, the time devoted to building and developing the heist, all the planning and little character moments. This is what makes an event powerful. The Aldhani heist is a masterclass of setup and payoff. Let's take a look at the characters. Obviously, we need to look at this in the grand scope of Cassian's story. The first arc introduced us to Cassian and what his beliefs were. He hates the Empire, but he doesn't really believe in a rebellion. So what the second arc does is expose Cassian to that rebellion. What do these people actually think? What are they like? What motivates them? What are their goals? The main way this is explored is the contrast between Nemik and Skeen. Nemik is the youthful and more committed person to the rebellion, while Skeen is the more jaded one who initially just wants to stick it to the Empire. The two characters go back and forth sharing their worldviews with Cassian. Even though Cassian does Nemik the courtesy of listening to his speeches about rebellion, he doesn't yet believe it. There's a moment where Nemik basically says this heist is going to do real damage to the Empire, but Cassian says the Empire won't look twice at it because they don't care. Cassian is of course wrong, as we'll learn in the next arc. Having these moments for Cassian is so important because changing a worldview is a lot harder than most movies set it out to be. This show needs to convince us that a selfish man would be willing to risk his life to defeat the Empire purely off of moral standing. That's a hard thing to realistically do. Narkina 5 is eventually what really changes him, but that doesn't work if the seeds of rebellion aren't planted in Cassian by Nemik himself. Obviously, he's exposed to other aspects of Imperial cruelty. Vel tells Cassian about the cultural genocide taking place against the Donnies, but what has a larger impact on Cassian is Skeen's betrayal. After the heist, Cassian learns that Skeen lied about the Empire killing his brother and that he's willing to steal the money and walk away. It doesn't take long for Cassian to kill him. Obviously, there's the double crossing that Cassian needs to be careful with. If Skeen was so willing to betray these people he spent months with, then he's more than willing to betray Cassian. But narratively, the main reason Cassian kills Skeen is because Skeen in a way is a reflection of Cassian. Remember, Cassian is only on this mission because of the money. He doesn't really care about the rebellion yet, but he grew to care about Nemik and the others and the larger cause. He may not be ready to fight for the rebellion, but he does want them to succeed. So when he looks at Skeen, he sees what he could potentially turn into, a deeply selfish man who doesn't care about anything besides himself. Cassian doesn't want to be like that, so he kills Skeen. Metaphorically, Cassian is killing off that part of himself. He could have very easily taken the money after killing Skeen and ran off, but he didn't, and that shows growth for the character. Every arc in the season plays a pivotal role in developing Cassian's story, from getting him to apathetic criminal to committed rebel. And this Aldhani arc was all about exposing Cassian to the rebellion, and it did so effectively. I know Mon Mothma and Luthen are obviously big parts of this arc, but I want to talk about their stories in its entirety without splitting it up by arc, so we'll do that when discussing Narkina 5. One of the more interesting parts of Andor is what they do with Cyril, because after the opening arc, Cyril doesn't have much importance in the rest of the story. We spend a lot of time with him and his mother and him losing his job, But when it comes to his impact on the plot, there's nothing there. He gives some intel to Miro and that's it. So why keep him around? Why devote so much more screen time to this character if he doesn't play a big role in the plot? Well, I think part of it is that he will have a larger role to play in season 2, so we'll just have to wait on that front. But more importantly, it's just an extension of what I spoke about with the first arc. Fascism doesn't just spread through tyrants, it spreads through ordinary people. We saw how ordinary Syril was in the first arc, and from the second arc and onwards, he is just as ordinary and committed as he was before. This man has such a moral vendetta against Cassian that he's going through such lengths to get this man arrested, which is ironic because Cassian does end up getting arrested, but no one knows about it. With Syril and Cassian, I also think there's a fascinating dichotomy between the roles their mothers play in their lives. Marva is someone that Cassian looks up to. Wanting to make her proud is something that deeply matters to him. She initially tries to motivate him into joining the rebellion, but he rejects. After her passing, in a way, her spirit lives on and it motivates him to join the rebellion. With Syril, his relationship with his mother is so toxic, I wouldn't be surprised if deep down he's trying to capture Cassian just to prove a point to his mother. Syril's mother thinks he's a low-life loser who needs to be handed a job by his uncle, so it definitely seems plausible to me that he is so committed because he just wants to prove his mother wrong. And that simple desire leads him to spreading fascism. It's a commentary on how parenting can continue this cycle of oppression. That's at least my takeaway. Let's now touch on Dedra Meero. What they did with her story is very similar to what they did with Syril's story. She's obviously the antagonist, but the writers are able to get us to root for her in a certain way. She's the protagonist of her own story. She is trying to uncover this rebel plot, and as she's spewing her suspicions about how the Starpath unit connects to all this, we know she is correct. Cassian may not be the mastermind she thinks he is, but he does play a big role in the wider rebel activity. Nemik also had a Starpath unit, so she was right that tracking down any stolen Imperial equipment was the right thing to do. But of course, every other Imperial officer thinks she is reaching, and eventually the Aldhani heist happens and she is proven correct. It's such an interesting storytelling technique where you give the villains their own antagonist. Syril had the higher-ups at Primor, and Meero has the rest of the ISB. Once she is given the green light to pursue all her endeavors, that is when she becomes the terrifying villain she was painted out to be. She's also just a smart character, and that makes her fun to watch. She's not bumbling around making stupid mistakes the whole time. This goes back to the whole treating Star Wars seriously point I made. Meero and the rest of the ISB and the rest of the Empire are treated seriously. They're smart, they're calculated, and they're ruthless. By treating the Empire seriously, it makes them a more intimidating threat. Does the Aldhani heist work if the Empire is treated like a joke? Probably not. But because they are, every single arc is that much more tense, especially as we'll see with Narkina 5. Before we move on to that arc, however, I want to discuss some of the political commentary in the Aldhani arc. Obviously, there are themes of genocide and bigotry here. All the Donnies were moved away to work in bigger cities. There's also the repeated disrespect of the Donnies and their culture. There are multiple references to how bad the Donnies smell. There's also the disrespect for their culture that I mentioned, like how they use one of their little temples for target practice. This is all pretty blatant and not subtle at all. What was a lot more subtle and horrifying in a way was how it portrayed cultural genocide through a softer form of oppression. Never do we actually see violence against the Donnies, and I don't believe it was ever even mentioned that there was any violence against them. Instead of just wiping out the Donnies, the Empire does its best to strip them of their culture. They make it a point that over the past decade, fewer and fewer of the Donnies show up to see the eye. The way they've done this wasn't through brute force, but through subtle manipulation. One of the Imperial officers mentions that they put a bunch of bars and pubs along the Donnies' path, and as a result, many of them get distracted and get drunk and are unable to make it to the event. That is the type of manipulation that can make an oppressive regime so terrifying, that they are so much more technologically advanced that they can manipulate the disenfranchised to get what they want. That is dark. So this is just another example of how Andor is able to separate itself apart because of its political commentary. The Aldhani arc did an excellent job at progressing every facet of this story, but I would argue that the Narkina 5 arc was the true highlight of the season. But before we move on to that, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform for anyone who wants to stand out online or start a business. Whether you're a content creator like me or someone who wishes to start their own movie blog, Squarespace is perfect for you. If you sign up today, you can use Blueprint AI to get a fully custom website in just a few steps. Squarespace also offers a complete library of professionally designed and award-winning website templates, so you can use it to build your own beautiful page that will capture your audience in a way that only you can. If you're looking to build your own store because you're passionate about a product you wish to sell or have a wonderful idea, you can use Squarespace Payments to manage all your earnings in one place. You can set a variety of different prices, tiers, and paywalls, all of that. Pretty much anything that will give your customers their best value. If you're a YouTuber and you wish to upload special behind-the-scenes videos or extended videos, you can do that as well. Create your own Squarespace domain without any hidden fees or add-ons required. Don't wait, invest in your dream domain today. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Again, that's squarespace.com/thegoldman to save 10% off your first purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Right off the bat, the thing I love the most about the Narkina 5 arc is that it's the perfect example of actions having consequences. The Aldhani heist pretty much affects every single one of our main characters. With Cassian, it obviously leads to him being falsely arrested. With Luthen, it escalates his desires with the rebellion. Marva feels inspired by the attack on the Empire. Dedramiro gains more power. Mon Mothma grows increasingly more stressed. And the only main character it doesn't directly affect is Cyril. The 7th episode is kind of its own standalone episode, and the entire episode is devoted to discussing the fallout of the heist. I just love that so much. Just as I said in the previous section, it's not just the actions of something that's powerful, but the reaction. Seeing the fallout of the heist affecting most of our characters is the perfect way to show how important the heist actually was. And it's not like we just see people reacting, we see how it directly impacts their stories going forward. This is how you develop an intertwined plot. There's also this great irony that Cassian thought nothing would come of this, and he is the one who ends up being affected the most. Security on Ferrix grows tighter, partially because of the events of the first arc of the season, but mostly because of the Public Order Resentencing Directive. If you don't remember what that is, after the Aldhani attack, the Empire passed new legislation called the Public Order Resentencing Directive, or PORD as I'll call it going forward. PORD basically tightens up security across the Empire. Prison sentences can be increased, penalties for potential anti-imperial activity are stronger, and it gives the Empire the authority to arrest people even over suspected crimes. With Luthen's story, we learn that this was his intention all along, not to simply steal money from the Empire, but to make them even more extreme and thus motivate more people towards rebellion. Considering Cassian by the end of the series is ready to join the rebellion, it turns out Luthen's plan worked. Where the real genius of this arc lies is with the storyline in the prison. This arc is not only a great example of setups and payoffs, it's not only a great example of actions having consequences, but it's also just so creatively and brilliantly done. So Cassian helps with the heist and it succeeds. As a result, the Empire passes PORD. As a result of that, Cassian gets arrested for doing nothing. The stormtroopers keep asking Cassian if he's a part of it, and we never even find out what it is. I love that Cassian is a wanted criminal of the Empire, so much so that the ISB is directly after him, but while he's in disguise as someone else, he gets arrested for doing nothing. It really hammers home the personal impact of PORD. So after he is arrested, he is brought to a prison where he is told he will serve a 6-year sentence. The crime used to just be 6 months, but because of PORD, it is now 6 years. While he is there, everyone is asking Cassian about PORD because all of their sentences were extended. Cassian doesn't even know about PORD. He doesn't even understand that his actions led to his own imprisonment and the increased sentences of all the people he helped save. Now, while Cassian is in the prison, because of PORD, one man upon completing his sentence is sent back to a different prison, and as a result of that, the entire floor finds out and gets fried because of it. While this is happening, because of the increased sentences, one of the cellmates, Ulaf, dies before he can complete his sentence. This allows Cassian and Kino to learn from the medic about what really happened on level 2. Also, since it's established that each inmate is replaced after they leave, a new inmate takes his place. This gives Cassian the window Kino to incorporate his plan, and thus they are able to escape, which he was motivated by after learning the truth about the indefinite sentences. Everything in this arc flows perfectly together. There's no coincidences for Cassian, there's no lucky breaks. The only breaks he gets is the carelessness of the prison guards, which has already been established as a theme of this series, that oppression leads to complacency by those in power. This is simply flawless plot progression. Episode 10 is the episode that gets praised the most as being the best episode of the season. While I definitely agree with that, I love the progression of the previous episode, episode 9. The episode begins with character development for Kino Loy. He is someone who just wants to put his head down, work, and complete his sentence. For a good portion of the episode, Cassian is bugging him about planning an escape, but Kino doesn't listen. There's the classic line, "How many guards are there on each level?" and Kino keeps ignoring him. Eventually, they all learn about level 2, and Cassian and Kino specifically learn about what actually went down, that all the cellmates are essentially serving indefinite sentences. This leads to Cassian again asking, "How many guards are there on each level?" and Kino replies, "Never more than 12. This is one of the best payoffs in the series. I remember getting so hyped that they were going to attempt their escape in the next episode, but then I got pissed when the episode ended because I had to wait a whole week to actually see the escape. To tie in what I said before, the prison arc establishes exactly what the threat is. There are never more than 12 guards. We know exactly what Cassian and the others will be up against. It lays the groundwork for their escape. I want to shift from the plot to the attention to detail, especially when it comes to the prison. This entire prison is not only so well thought through, but it is so creative. We've seen prison escape sequences like this plenty of times before. It could have been so easy for this prison to just be more of the same, but the creativity behind it makes this entire sequence so much more fun to watch. It turns out that the way the guards are able to control the inmates is through electrifying the floor. The guards wear special boots while the inmates are all barefoot. Because they can just use the floor as control, they don't need as many guards. And because there aren't as many guards in the prison, when things go wrong for them, it's easier for the inmates to rise up and take over the prison. So not only was this prison so creative, but it also ties into the themes of the show. As we learn with the post-credit scene, the Empire is trying to build the Death Star as efficiently as possible. PORD allows them to pretty much use slave labor, and the prison as a whole requires very little security, which is also cheaper for the Empire. There's also how cruel the prison is. They put numbers in front of everyone's beds, which gives them hope that they can one day leave, motivating them to keep working hard. There's also the in-cell competition, that the best group gets flavor in their food, while the worst group gets electrocuted. But then we learn because of PRD, when the number is up, it turns out they just put the inmates back into a different prison, forcing them to work indefinitely. That is so brilliant, yet so cruel. When thinking about the prison and how it was constructed, I tried my best to put on my nitpicking YouTube hat and see if I could find any fault in the logic here. But the prison was designed pretty excellently. Let me know if you could think of something, because I can't find any holes here. The other part of the prison that was so creative was simply the people within it. I feel like there are so many standard tropes in prison stories. Maybe there's gang members that seem all tough and whatnot. Maybe there's a fight that breaks out inside the prison because everyone's a thug. Or even when there's an escape, some of the prisoners will double cross each other because they're prisoners, they can't be trusted. But there's none of that here. It turns out everyone in the prison seems to be a decent person. Kino is the only antagonist within the prison, and he ends up going on a powerful arc where he becomes a leader. When all the prisoners are escaping, they're actually working together to get as many people out as they can. Everything about this prison and this storyline breaks from traditional prison tropes, and I love that about this arc. There's also the theme about how the Empire likes to take over by dividing people. Not only in this prison do they divide all these different sections of the prison, but inside each cell, different groups are divided against each other. But the prisoners still come together in the end, and that is how they're able to escape. Now, regardless of how creative everything is, or whether or not the plot flows nicely, what's more important are the characters and their stories. So let's dive into that. Following the Aldhani heist, Cassian has exposed himself to the rebellion, but he's not ready to commit himself to it yet. He still has hopes he can grab his mother and just move away somewhere and live his life. The Empire is certainly a problem, but as long as you put your head down, things will be okay, right? Wrong. Only days after he arrives in Yamos is he arrested for doing nothing and is thrown in prison to serve a 6-year sentence. It was so important that Cassian gets arrested for doing nothing because it challenges his world worldview. He now has first-hand experience with the knowledge that you can't just avoid the Empire. It will come after you regardless of what you do, whether you're innocent or not. In episode 8, when he first arrives in the prison, Diego Luna does such an excellent job at portraying the trauma Cassian feels. This man is going through the ringer right now. He is in shock. This can't be happening right now. He has to get out. This is where Kino Loy comes in. Kino is such a perfect counterpart to Cassian because he represents the older version of Cassian. It was just a few episodes ago that Cassian thought he could avoid the cruelty of the Empire. Inside this prison, Kino is the epitome of, let me just do my job so I can go home. Kino believes if he just keeps his head down and doesn't cause any trouble, then he will be okay. The reason it was so important that Kino be betrayed this way is because Cassian is now forced into Luthen's shoes. Cassian needs to convince this guy to rebel. He needs to convince a guy that just wants to avoid the Empire to fight against it. This is what radicalizes Cassian to join the rebellion, because Cassian is the leader of the rebellion inside the prison. So through Kino Loy, he's able to put himself in Luthen's shoes and he is ready to fight. He realizes that what Nemik tried to teach him was correct. I love that there's not a singular moment where Cassian changes. It's not like you can pinpoint a specific moment where you can say, yup, right there is where he decided to join the rebellion. You may argue that it was the scene on the beach in episode 11, but I could very well argue for any other point during the prison arc. I could even argue for the moment where he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. In a TV show like this, there doesn't have to be a specific moment where the character changes. It's for the best because characters can grow and change over the course of this 12-episode season, because that's the point of a 12-episode series, to dive in deep and take your time with the plot and the characters. That's why I love Cassian's change here. I want to touch on one more thing with Kino real quick. I loved the ending to his character. The fact that he did all this knowing he couldn't escape because he can't swim adds so much depth to the character. There are a handful of little moments throughout episode 10 that hint at this. He says things like, I'm just gonna assume I'm dead, and there's also the moment where he doesn't jump on the table when he knows the floor is going to be electrocuted. There's just something so chilling about seeing him standing there in the end wondering what his fate is going to be. There are some reports that Kino will be in season 2, and I really hope that isn't the case. Sure, I would love to see Andy Serkis again, but I want his fate to be ambiguous. I think it adds so much weight to Cassian's story if he doesn't know what happened to all the other prisoners on Narkina 5. It could give him a lot more motivation to do some questionable things on behalf of the rebellion, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens in season 2. Mon Mothma is maybe the most surprising character in this show. Throughout Star Wars, she has kind of just been there. She was best known for her one scene in Return of the Jedi, and whenever she showed up in the Disney Star Wars projects, it kind of just felt like fan service. Oh look, there's Mon Mothma in Rogue One. Oh look, there's Mon Mothma in Rebels. Andor not only turns her into a real character, but one with such a tragic story. The basic premise of her story in season 1 is that she is secretly funding rebel activities. After Aldhani, she learns that she's going to be investigated. If the Empire finds out that she has a shit ton of money missing, they will suspect her of rebel activity and arrest her. In order to save her own ass, she makes a deal with a rich Chandrilan who gives her money as long as her daughter marries his son. This sounds like the most non-Star Wars plotline you could give a character in Star Wars, but the reason it works so well is because of the weight it adds to the Rebel Alliance. The one thing people praise the most about Rogue One and Andor is the depth it adds to the rebellion. Rogue One showed us a bit of the darker side to the rebellion. It also shows first-hand accounts of people who didn't live to see rebel victory. Andor pretty much double downs on this in every way. But with Mon Mothma and Andor, it shows the different kinds of sacrifices people in the rebellion make. The season makes it explicitly clear that Mon Mothma is not a happy woman. The Senate never listens to her. She had an arranged marriage with a man she doesn't like, and her daughter disrespects her constantly. At the end of the season, she's given the option to save her skin if she can marry her daughter off to someone else. This may sound like a no-brainer, but I see it as Mon Mothma condemning her daughter to the same miserable life she has. Mon Mothma has an arranged marriage and she is miserable, so she has to choose between her daughter's happiness and well-being or what's best for the rebellion, and she chooses the rebellion. You could argue that I'm over-exaggerating her daughter's potential misery, like who knows, maybe this little kid is a good guy, but I can't help but draw the conclusion I did because most of the time the story is devoted to showing us how miserable Mon Mothma is. The story doesn't necessarily frame this as the right decision or not, and that's great because Andor just wants you to consider all the different sacrifices people make for the sake of the rebellion, to emphasize truly how hard revolution is. Now, the other character who is more than willing to sacrifice everything is, of course, Luthen. Luthen is the kind of rebel we have never seen before. He is literally willing to do anything to defeat the Empire. His character really comes into its own during this arc, because before he just seems like a really smart rebel who has a plan to steal Imperial funds, but because after we learn that it was his intention that the Empire reacts harshly, it reframes his character. I like that Luthen is contrasted with Saw in this series because Saw is similar in some ways, but different in others. Saw is an extremist, kind of like Luthen, but Saw is crazy enough that he believes what he is doing is right. Luthen, on the other hand, doesn't think what he's doing is right. He knows that what he is doing is going to hurt a lot of people. He is a smart guy. He knows the response to the Aldhani heist is going to hurt billions of people. I mean, we only saw Cassian being arrested, but we didn't see the likely millions of people falsely accused of crimes as well. Luthen knows this is going to happen, but he doesn't care. For Luthen, he's willing to do whatever it takes to defeat the rebellion. He is not going to play by any rules. He will sacrifice anyone he can for victory. And this includes himself, by the way. As he says in his famous speech, he's accepted that he's fighting for a sunrise he knows he'll never see. But what needs to be done, needs to be done. That's what makes Luthen such a fascinating character. A person willing to do terrible things, knowing they're terrible things for the greater good. What are people in the rebellion willing to sacrifice? For some, literally everything. Before we move on to the final arc of the season, we have to talk about the major political themes of the arc. And that is, of course, the prison system. I'm not too much of an expert on the topic, but I've heard the multitude of criticisms levied towards the American prison complex. The fact that America has the highest incarceration rates in the world, the fact that many prisons are overcrowded, violent, and quite inhumane, the fact that there are private prisons that profit greatly from the work of its prisoners. Again, I'm no expert, so feel free to dispute any of my claims in the comments, but the parallels between Narkina 5 and the American prison system are a lot more similar than you might think. Sure, there's no prison in America that's as cruel as the one in Narkina 5, but I think the wider criticisms made in this arc are still effective. This 3 to 4 episode arc is up there for the best that Star Wars has to offer. Everything about it was borderline perfect. So let's wrap things up by talking about the concluding arc. The final arc is where everything comes together. All video I've spoken about how the storylines have had a logical progression. Storylines never felt out of place or forced, everything had cause and effect. This culminates in the revolt on Ferrix. I just love it so much that you can draw a direct line from Cassian killing those 2 cops all the way to the people of Ferrix revolting. Now, before, the way I described it was like a tree branch. I said that the story started from one single moment and everything branched out from there. What the even better stories do is have all their stories climax or peak at the same moment near the end of the story. This is something that The Last Jedi did. If you're willing to hear out something your least favorite movie did potentially well, I implore you to keep listening. The movie had 3 storylines, right? The stuff with Rey, the stuff with Finn, and the stuff with Poe. You can debate all you want about the semantics of the Holdo maneuver, but in that singular moment, all 3 of these storylines were directly affected. For Rey, it was the climax of her fight with Kylo Ren. For Finn, it was the climax of his failed attempt at turning off the tracker. And for Poe, it was the climax of his plan to get away from the First Order. Had the events and the lore implications surrounding the Holdo maneuver been different, this could have been one of the coolest moments in Star Wars. The parallel to Andor I want to draw is how almost every storyline in the end climaxes with a revolt on Ferrix. For Cassian, obviously the whole occupation was his fault, and seeing these people rise up coincided with him personally rising up against the Empire as well. For Luthen, he and Vel were there so they could kill Cassian, but it leads them to Cassian himself admitting he wants to join the rebellion. For Cyril, it gives him a chance to save Dedra Meero, which was something that gave him purpose since he got fired all the way back in episode 4. And with Dedra Meero herself, she had kind of been on this unstoppable rise since her introduction in episode 4, and this was the first time she felt any sort of challenge. Her plan to organize surprise around Marva's funeral backfired and she almost got seriously hurt because of it. So not only are most of the main characters directly impacted by the revolt on Ferrix, but the reason each of these characters are here makes perfect sense too. The story did the legwork, so it feels natural that all these plotlines crescend at the same time. And better yet, they all have to do with Cassian Andor, aka the titular character of the show. Marva's death is what sets things in motion. Sure, you could argue that this was a random event, but given her deteriorating state in the previous episodes, it's not the most random thing in the world. Her death had consequences, and that was the revolt and everyone's reasons for being there. The only character who was not directly impacted by the events on Ferrix was Mon Mothma, which is fine, I guess. Not every single character needed to be here, but every other major character was. To harken back to this show treating things seriously, this revolt only works if throughout the entirety of the show, characters and storylines were treated seriously. Through 12 episodes, the writers took their time showing how close-knit of a community Ferrix was. I explained how the first arc mostly did this, but even after that, Ferrix continued to get development, and it led to a slow tension brewing between the Ferrix community and the Empire. With the Empire, each of the first 3 arcs treated the Empire seriously. Sure, Pre-Mor was just an extension of the Empire, but even as the least competent force, they were treated seriously. The Imperials on Aldhani were treated seriously, and we saw how brutal the Empire was on Narkina 5. All that built up to the threat that the Empire posed here on Ferrix. The writers also treated Marva's death seriously. Her alone having such a big funeral shows how important community is to Ferrix. And after a lot of these people saw how she was treated in the first arc, it makes perfect sense that her speech is what would trigger them to really fight back for the first time. This show takes things so seriously that even the stuttering little droid was taken seriously. With the character development, I mean, there's not much change here. At this point, everyone has gone on their arcs and they have been developed. We are just seeing the story solidify that. With Cassian, he has forever been changed by what happened to him on Narkina 5. So all we needed to see from him was him saving his friends from the Empire and going to Luthen admitting he's ready to join the rebellion. The most interesting character work we got in these final 2 episodes is the situation with Anton Kreegyr. Luthen and Saw orchestrated a plan where a man named Kreegyr would attack the Empire with 40 men. Eventually, the Empire found out about the plan and were going to ambush Kreegyr and his men. But because Luthen has spies everywhere, he found out the Empire found out and he has a decision to make now. Does he call off the attack, sparing the lives of 40 men but also risking his contact within the Empire? Or does he let the plan go through, allowing the Empire to feel invincible, maintaining his contact, but also allowing 40 of his own men to die? This was such a fascinating moral dilemma. The storyline is brief and one that doesn't ultimately tie into Cassian and his story whatsoever, but it alone adds so much depth to Luthen and the rebellion. Luthen famously said he's willing to sacrifice everything, so I like that the story took the time to show that he's serious. He concluded that maintaining his contact within the Empire and giving the Empire a false sense of security was what was better for the rebellion, so he willingly let those 40 men and Kreegyr die. I think this storyline could have been much more effective if we actually met Kreegyr a few times. Add like 3 2-minute scenes throughout the season where Kreegyr goes to Luthen's shop where they discuss the plan. This way, when Luthen lets Kreegyr die, it feels a lot more personal. It would absolutely hammer home that Luthen is willing to sacrifice literally everything. That is maybe the only rewrite I'd suggest in the entire season. With the political messages in this brief arc, the writers are obviously making a commentary here on police response to protests. This has been somewhat of a big debate within politics, so I'm not surprised seeing it discussed here in Andor. But the part of the arc that resonated far more with me was Nemik's manifesto. The manifesto famously ends with Nemik telling Cassian to try, which contradicts the even more famous line from Yoda, "Do or do not, there is no try." Both quotes work given the stories that they were telling. Luke was someone with serious doubts about the Force and his own abilities, that he needed to be told to shut up and just do the thing. With a show like Andor, it focuses on rebellion and how in its early stages it seems so impossible. How can you defeat an overwhelming force such as the Empire? Well, just try. If everyone just tries, then who knows? Maybe they can accomplish their goal one day. Andor is such a marvel. From the characters to the themes to the plot lines to the attention to detail, it all culminates into one of the best seasons of television I have ever seen. What do most people have to say about Andor Season 1? Well, let's check out the ratings and see what they have to say. Andor Season 1 scored a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with an 87% audience score. On IMDb, Season 1 scored an 8.4 out of 10. The highest rated episode of the season was Episode 10, One Way Out, with a 9.5 out of 10, and the lowest rated episode was That Would Be Me, with a 7.3 out of 10. Also, of the 9 seasons of Star Wars on Disney+, according to IMDb, Andor was rated 3rd, behind the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. What do you think about Andor Season 1, and how excited are you for Season 2? Let me know down below. Tune in next week where we'll review Daredevil Born Again, so stay tuned for that. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to join the Glod Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.